There are times when I wonder if the Paradox developers deliberately nerf otherwise fun aspects of the Victoria 3 experience for the sake of playing a haughty little prank on the player base. Maybe they're in their office, laughing at the overtuning or crash out of mechanics that people are forced to interact with, just knowing that we will have to maneuver around them in every single game with gritted teeth and irritation in our hearts. I make this declaration because I was one of the many people who were raving about how powerful ports had become, predominantly in the cost/efficiency ratio for infrastructure for shoreline states. Ports, for the longest time, had become one of the biggest jokes in Victoria 3, often deliberately ignored or overlooked as nothing more than convoys for the convoy machine. In 1.9, however, they offered 5 infrastructure per level and were relatively cheap compared to how they were before, including the fact that they took the restrictions on how many you could build off. Naturally, such a change made a bit of a quandary since it made the railways unviable, and it even led to players completely bypassing the once pivotal railways technology for 10 to even 20 years by building only in shoreline states where they could build ports. That naturally cannot be accepted. How dare you ruin the intended meta? I am absolutely sure by now some of you multiplayer people out there will know what I'm talking about. How often have you seen entire countries build up entirely on ports since 1.9 first dropped? I'm betting it was a lot, and it probably spread to the point where every single country out there was effectively a modern Shanghai by the end of your games. That is obviously a very big factor as to why ports were quickly tuned down with continual hotfix patches after 1.9's release. However, there is in fact such a thing as over-nerfing, going from a maximum of plus 10 infrastructure per port down to a maximum of plus 5 per port completely hampered the existence of ports to the point where they have become a nuisance rather than a need. In the early game, when ports used to be the most important method of gaining infrastructure, you now have no choice but to upgrade to the second level of the production method to get a whopping plus 3 infrastructure per port. That means rather hefty shipyard good costs, and with the subsidy costs ranging in the 200 to 600 range, that can equate up to £200 per infrastructure. Not exactly efficient, especially if you are a small, podunk country. I know there are clearly a lot of small shoreline countries that were designed to rely on port infrastructure early in the game too. They begin with infrastructure penalties, and maneuvering through their infrastructure problems is now the equivalent to cave diving. It's really cramped in here, and it is terrifying. How many tall Chile players out there deeply wish that their ports were a little bit better as they wait up to 15 years for railways to finally pass? I'm willing to bet that there are a lot of you out there who are just as upset with the port changes as I am. Maybe this would not be such an overcorrection were it not for the fact that we are completely stuck subsidizing the ports in the first place. The recent addition of merchant marines was obviously intended to offset the need to subsidize ports, yet ports overproduce merchant marines. They overproduce merchant marines to the point where I do not think that it is actually possible to have a shortage of merchant marines for any country that is not completely landlocked. That means that there are almost no opportunities to trade merchant marines, and often the only way to keep port subsidies away from becoming crippling is to subvent merchant marines so you can offload your garbage to the world at a cheaper price than they themselves are producing. You hurt them in the process by doing this, ironically, because that is how worthless ports have become. We are at a point where ports have become so overcorrected that their only true use at this moment is convoys. Once more, only convoys. Convoys, sadly, have become effectively worthless if you are not conquering overseas, which means tall players can pretty much ignore what I'm about to say. As for those of us who are conquering overseas, well, they are an absolute detriment, far worse than any infamy cost could be. There are not many indicators out there beyond trial and error to actually know upfront how many convoys are going to be needed when you send your troops overseas. Maybe if you memorize the formula upfront, it is not so bad, but for those of us who are really bad at math, it is a nightmare to figure out, and it's literally just going back and forth seeing how many troops you have to move before you actually start the war. Meanwhile, overproducing ports costs an arm and a leg for almost no benefits, despite the fact that it is really easy to do. The measly 3 infrastructure per port hardly makes a dent, because it is the equivalent of 1.5 manufactory buildings for an obscene construction investment cost and an inevitable obscene subsidy cost. Yeah, we are employing people by doing so, but again, it is not nearly enough to offset the penalties of using ports, and once more, ports are being relegated to being considered worthless by the wider community as a result. Despite all the changes to the ports in all of these patches, the outlook towards them has not changed one bit. I actively hate having too many ports in my country so much that I actually waste 100 authority every game to monopolize them right away so that other countries cannot build 1 trillion of them when I give out foreign investment rights to my country. Yet, unfortunately, the private sector still inexplicably finds a way to make them even with the monopoly on. It is frustrating. I do not want those ports. I hate those ports. They are awful. Make them go away. I think at this point it is time Paradox once more revisited ports. Again, I am not qualified to talk about these things as if I'm an expert. At best, I am only somewhat good at Victoria 3, but I do believe one of the best ways to make ports good again is to either drastically reduce the amount of merchant marines that they produce, or to increase the amount of merchant marine goods that are needed for trading centers. The huge imbalance and overproduction of merchant marines keeps ports from ever actually mattering. Even if you actively stop the creation of ports and only keep the bare minimum of necessary convoys, you will still have a deficit in demand for merchant marines. It goes against everything a game about trade stands for, and it actively makes ports the worst building in the game by far. What is the point in lifting the restriction on how many ports we can build if you're just gonna make us not want them in the first place? I understand the need for keeping the amount of infrastructure down, I really do, yet you should still be able to reward smart players for making intelligent moves to keep the cost of ports down so they can overbuild them and get a sizable chunk of infrastructure for doing so. Right now, that is simply not possible. Even when I fully subvent merchant marines, I maintain a deficit. That includes the fact that I have done everything in my power to keep a minimal amount of convoys, so something direly needs to change for ports for them to ever become viable again, and frankly, I sincerely hope they become viable, and quickly. I want my 100 authority back. What a waste it is to monopolize a building just for the sake of preventing it from being built at all because of how bad it is. I want to be able to build a port and feel like I'm being rewarded for doing so again. I want them to be part of a good chain that is gratifying to work with, just like the construction cycle. Okay, I should have to ask myself, do I need more ports? Rather than asking myself, should I waste money nationalizing these ports so I can delete this trash? Anyhow, thank you for taking the time to listen to my whiny little TED Talk. I hope you still enjoy playing Victoria 3 in spite of it. Just always remember, Hail Hydra Cat.